Before the village wakes, before the first kettle hums, and before the light fully finds its way into the narrow lane, there is a small bakery quietly waiting. On Willow Lane, where ivy climbs slowly and mornings arrive without hurry, a man begins his work long before the rest of the world stirs. His hands know the rhythm of bread, and his days for many years have followed the same quiet path. But even the most familiar mornings can carry something new, if we are willing to notice. And before we begin, my dear, if you'd like to help this little corner of quiet grow, you might do Grandma a small favour and gently like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can easily find Grandma again and we can share many more peaceful evenings together. Now let yourself get comfortable. Long before the village woke, before the first kettle murmured or the first curtain stirred, a light appeared in the window of the bakery on Willow Lane. It was never a sudden light. It came softly, almost as if it had been there all along, and was only now choosing to be seen. First, a faint glow from the small upstairs room, then a narrow line of gold beneath the door, and finally the warm, steady shine of the lamps inside the bakery, spreading slowly across the wooden floor and resting gently against the glass. At that hour, Willow Lane belonged to silence. The lane curved in a quiet bend, paved with old cobbles that remembered every season: summer warmth, autumn rain, the thin frost of winter mornings. The houses stood close together, their brickwork softened by time, their windows framed with ivy that climbed with unurgency. A tailor's shop sat halfway down, its shutters painted blue, but worn pale in places, and beyond it a small stationer's with paper shapes hanging still behind the glass. At the centre of the lane, beneath the long trailing branches of a willow tree, stood the bakery. Its sign gently faded read, "Alder's Bread and Buns." Inside, Thomas Alder was already awake. He had been awake for some time, though he never kept track of exactly how long. After so many years, the hour before dawn had become something he felt rather than measured. The quiet itself seemed to call him from sleep. He had risen in the dim stillness of the room above the shop, dressed without haste, and tied his apron with the same small, practised motion he had used every morning for decades. Now he stood at the bottom of the narrow stairs, one hand resting lightly on the wooden rail, as if pausing between two parts of the day. The bakery was cool. Not cold, but holding the calm of the night, along with the faint, comforting scent of yesterday's bread. A bakery never entirely forgot what had been made inside it. Even in silence, there was always something lingering, a trace of flour in the air, a quiet sweetness in the wood, a memory held in the walls. Thomas let the room settle around him. The long central table stood waiting, pale from years of careful scrubbing. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of seeds, tins of flour, and neatly stacked trays. At the back of the room, the oven rested, large, brick-lined and quiet, like something asleep, but not entirely. After a moment, he nodded slightly to himself and stepped forward. He opened the shutters first. One by one, the wooden panels folded back, revealing the faint outline of the lane beyond. There was little to see yet, only shapes and shadows, the suggestion of rooftops, and the gentle curve of the street. Still, Thomas always opened the shutters early. It was, in its own way, a greeting. Then he lit the lamps properly. The light grew warmer, steadier, settling into the room as if it belonged there. It touched the edges of the table, the glass jars, the worn handles of drawers, bringing each thing quietly into view. After that, he turned to the oven. This was always his favourite part. He knelt, opened the iron door, and laid the kindling carefully. He never rushed this stage. Fire, he believed, preferred patience. A spark, a breath, a moment's waiting. Then a small flame took hold. He fed it gently, building it piece by piece, until it answered with a steady, living warmth. "Easy now," he murmured. The oven responded with a low, quiet crackle. When he stood again, the bakery had changed. It was no longer simply a room in the dark, but something awake, something beginning. Thomas moved to the shelves and selected a large ceramic bowl, its rim marked with a thin blue line. He set it down on the table with a soft, familiar sound and began to gather what he needed. Flour, water, yeast, salt. He worked without scales, measuring by feel and memory. His hands moved with quiet certainty, as though they understood the work before he gave it thought. Flour fell into the bowl in soft, pale clouds. Water followed, clear and simple. The yeast brought with it a faint, earthy scent, something alive, something ready. He stirred at first with a wooden spoon, then set it aside and placed his hands into the mixture. Soon he was kneading. Fold, press, turn. Fold, press, turn. The dough resisted at first, uneven and rough, but slowly it began to change. It softened beneath his hands, growing smoother, more willing. The rhythm settled into something steady, almost like breathing. The room warmed as he worked. Behind him, the oven deepened its quiet heat. The air shifted, carrying the faint scent of flour and yeast. Outside, the darkness began to loosen, though the sun had not yet appeared. When the dough was ready, he covered it with a cloth and set it aside to rise. He began another. This one was different, richer. Butter softened just enough. Milk warmed gently on the stove. A handful of currants prepared the night before. As he worked the ingredients together, the scent in the bakery deepened, becoming warmer, softer, touched with sweetness. Thomas moved without hurry. He had long believed that bread noticed such things, that it responded in its own quiet way to the care with which it was made. When the second dough was set aside, he turned to the pastry bench. The marble surface was cool beneath his hands. He dusted it lightly with flour and began preparing the dough for the morning's pastries. Apples were sliced thin, their clean, sharp scent cutting gently through the warmth of the room. Sugar followed, then a little spice, just enough. As he reached for the jar of nutmeg, his hand paused. The scent rose faintly as he lifted the lid. For a moment, the bakery seemed to hold its breath. There was something in that smell, something distant, a memory, perhaps, a different kitchen, light falling in another way, a voice just out of reach. Thomas stood very still. Then the oven gave a stronger crack from within its brick walls, and the moment passed. He grated the nutmeg over the apples, closed the jar, and set it back on the shelf. "That will do," he said quietly. Whether he spoke to the recipe or to the memory itself, he did not consider. He folded the pastries carefully, crimping the edges with quiet precision, and arranged them neatly on trays. By the time he placed the first trays into the oven, the bakery had fully changed. The air was warm now. The windows had begun to mist at the corners. The stillness had softened into something gently active, as if the room itself were taking part in the morning. While the bread baked, Thomas tidied the space. Bowls were washed and set to dry. The table was wiped clean. Trays were arranged. He set out paper bags beneath the counter and filled a glass jar with barley sugar sweets for the children who would come later. On the front counter, he placed a small vase with a few yellow flowers, their heads still heavy with sleep. Only when everything was in its place did he make his tea. He brewed it strong and poured it into a thick white mug, worn smooth with use. He did not sit. Instead, he stood by the window, holding the mug in both hands, and looked out at Willow Lane as it slowly returned to itself. A curtain shifted in an upstairs window. A chimney began to smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a cart moved softly over the stones. The village was not yet awake, but it was no longer asleep. Thomas knew its rhythms well. He could almost hear the day before it arrived, the familiar sounds that would follow, footsteps, doors, quiet greetings exchanged in low voices. He sipped his tea and let the moment linger. Then he set the mug aside and returned to the oven. The loaves were ready. He opened the door and was met with a bloom of warmth. One by one he drew them out, their crusts deep and golden, their surfaces lightly dusted with flour. As they were set on the rack, a soft crackling sound followed, and steam rose into the air. The smell filled the room at once. It was a simple smell, but a complete one. Warm,
steady and reassuring. It carried with it the sense of something made with care, something ready to be shared. Thomas stood for a moment beside the cooling loaves. Then he moved on. By 6 o'clock, the bakery was ready. Loaves rested on racks. Buns shone with a light glaze. Apple turnovers sat in neat, even rows. On the counter, a chalkboard listed the day's offerings in careful, familiar writing.
Thomas wiped his hands, crossed the room, and opened the front door. Cool morning air slipped inside, meeting the warmth of the bakery and softening as it entered. From the willow tree above, the first birds began to sing, tentative at first, then clearer. The village was waking. Thomas stepped back inside, washed his hands once more, and took his place behind the counter. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its hands moving toward the hour. For a moment, everything felt balanced. The warmth of the oven, the scent of fresh bread, the quiet promise of the day beginning. Then, from outside, came the sound of slow footsteps on the cobbles. Measured, unhurried. Thomas lifted his head and waited.
The first customer of the morning was always the one who arrived as though the bakery had opened solely for him. On most days, that was Mr. Pike. Thomas had heard his footsteps before the door even opened, slow, steady, and familiar on the cobbles outside, followed by the brief scrape of a shoe against the step. Then came the small pause that always seemed to happen before he entered, as though he were gathering himself for the important business of being first. The bell above the door gave a light, tidy ring. In came Mr. Pike, bringing with him a thread of cool morning air and the smell of damp wool. He was a thin man in a brown coat that had once been respectable and had since settled into usefulness. His post-bag hung at his side even when it was empty, as though he could not quite imagine himself without it. His cap sat squarely on his head, and his white moustache moved a little when he spoke, which it soon did.
Morning, Thomas. Morning, Mr. Pike. You're early. Thomas looked up from the counter, and the faintest suggestion of a smile appeared. So are you. Mr. Pike gave a quiet sound that might have been a laugh if it had gone any farther. He removed his gloves finger by finger and stepped toward the bread racks with the solemn attention of a man selecting books from a library. He did this every morning, though he bought nearly the same thing every time. Cold start, he said. It is. Not freezing yet. Not yet. Mr. Pike nodded, as if this confirmed something significant. He peered at the rolls, then at the loaves, then at the rolls again, though Thomas could already have wrapped his order without asking. One crusty roll, Mr. Pike said at last, and half a loaf, the darker one, if you please.
Thomas selected the roll with the best crust, cut a loaf cleanly through, wrapped both in paper, and tied the parcel with string. Mr. Pike placed a few coins on the counter with great care, then rested his fingers on the parcel for a moment, rather than picking it up straight away. "Smells especially good this morning," he said. Thomas glanced toward the cooling racks. "The oven behaved itself?" "That helps." "It does." Mr. Pike took his parcel, tucked it under one arm, and nodded once, the way one might nod to a fellow tradesman at the start of a shared shift. Then he left, the bell giving another soft ring as the door closed behind him. The bakery was quiet again, but not for long. There were some mornings in Willow Lane when the village seemed to wake all at once, as if a signal had been given somewhere beyond the rooftops. Other mornings, like this one, it woke gradually. One person, then another. A latch lifting, a curtain drawn, a voice in the street. The day building itself in small, ordinary pieces.
The second customer was Mrs. Fenwick. She arrived in a plum-coloured coat with a fur collar that had thinned over the years, but was still worn with dignity. Her hat was pinned neatly, her gloves buttoned, and she carried herself with the quiet resolve of a woman who had decided long ago that the world would be better if people stood up straight and said exactly what they meant. The bell rang. In she came. "Good morning, Thomas." "Good morning, Mrs. Fenwick." She paused just inside the door, breathing in the warm air of the bakery as though it were medicine. "Well," she said, "that is a comfort." Thomas reached for a pair of tongs. "Currant buns?" Mrs. Fenwick gave him a level look. "You make it sound as though I am predictable." Thomas said nothing. After a moment, the corner of her mouth twitched.
"Yes," she said. "2, please, and one of the apple turnovers, though I shall pretend it is not for me." Thomas wrapped the buns and turnover neatly. Mrs. Fenwick liked things wrapped neatly. Once, years ago, when Thomas had folded the paper in haste on an especially busy morning, she had said, in a tone of gentle disappointment, "A good parcel is part of the meal." He had never forgotten it. "You've put the yellow flowers out," she said, noticing the vase on the counter. "I had a few left in the garden. They're cheerful." He nodded. Mrs. Fenwick placed exact coins on the counter. She, unlike Mr. Pike, never lingered over payment. She believed in precision where money was concerned, and sentiment everywhere else. As Thomas handed her the parcel, she looked around the bakery in the quiet way she had, taking stock without seeming to. "It's a good room," she said. Thomas glanced up, surprised enough to show it. Mrs. Fenwick adjusted one glove at the wrist. "I'm not making conversation," she said. "I'm stating a fact." "I see." She took her parcel and drew herself up a little taller. "There are not many places left where things are made properly. People notice, even when they don't say so." Then, perhaps because she had said more than she intended, she gave a brisk nod and left before Thomas could answer. The bell settled back into silence. Thomas stood for a moment with one hand resting on the counter. He looked toward the window, where the morning light had grown clearer. The sky above the lane was now pale and open, the kind of grey-blue that belonged only to early hours. Outside, the village had begun its proper day. A bicycle passed. Somewhere farther down, a door closed firmly. Voices carried for a moment, then softened into distance.
He turned to straighten a basket that did not strictly need straightening. The next arrival was not a customer at all, but little Elsie Turner, who burst into the bakery with the kind of energy only children seemed able to summon so early in the morning. The bell rang sharply as the door flew open. "Mr. Alder!" Thomas looked up just in time to see her skidding to a stop on the mat, cheeks pink from the cold, scarf half undone, one glove missing. "Good morning, Elsie. Mum says 2 buns, but not the sticky kind because Daniel got it on the curtains last time, and she said never again, only she didn't mean never buns, she just meant not sticky ones."
Elsie spoke in one breath and then beamed at him as though the matter had been handled with remarkable clarity.
Thomas considered this. 2 currant buns. Yes, please, and I have the money. She frowned, digging into her coat pocket. I had it. I definitely had it. From the second pocket emerged a marble, a pencil stub, a piece of string, and a button. Thomas waited. At last Elsie produced the coins and placed them on the counter with visible relief. There, she said. There. He wrapped the buns and handed them across. Elsie accepted the parcel, then craned her neck toward the barley sugar jar. Did you put those there today? I did. For children? For customers? Elsie thought this over seriously. I am a customer. Thomas lifted the lid and placed 1 twist of barley sugar beside her parcel.
Elsie's face lit with triumph. Thank you, Mr. Alder. You're welcome. Straight home? Yes. She was already halfway out the door before the word finished. Thomas watched her go, then turned back to the counter, where the little collection of objects from her pocket remained: the marble, the pencil, the string, and the button. He gathered them carefully and placed them in a small dish near the till. Experience had taught him she would be back for at least 2 of the 4. The morning continued. Miss Ivy from the stationer's came in next, smelling faintly of lavender and paper. She bought a small loaf and 1 honey cake slice, wrapped separately. Mr. and Mrs. Bell from the cottage near the green arrived together and spent longer deciding between seeded rolls and farmhouse bread than either choice seemed to require. Then came Mrs. Turner at last, apologising for Elsie's speed, followed by the doctor's assistant, then the school caretaker, then a young man Thomas knew only by face, but not yet by name.
Each entered with some part of the outside world still clinging to them. Cold air, wet hems, half-finished thoughts, the beginning of errands and obligations. And each, in stepping into the bakery, seemed to soften a little. That was something Thomas had noticed over the years. People came in carrying the shape of their mornings with them: worry, hurry, distraction, sleep. But the warmth of the room and the smell of bread changed them, if only for a minute or 2. Voices lowered, shoulders eased, people remembered to smile. By 7:30, the racks had begun to thin. Thomas moved calmly between the counter and the bread shelves, wrapping parcels, slicing loaves, counting change. He was not a man of many words, but he knew how to speak just enough to each person, never too little, never more than was welcome. To some, he offered a remark about the weather. To others, a quiet question: "How is your mother?" or "Did the roof hold in the rain?" And sometimes he said nothing at all, only nodded in a way that let a person know they had been seen properly. This too people noticed.
On Willow Lane, Thomas Alder was known not only for his bread, but for his steadiness. He was part of the village in the way certain things were part of it: the church clock, the old willow tree, the postman's route, the market cart on Wednesdays. He was simply there, reliable as the morning. And yet there remained about him a certain distance. No one could have said he was unfriendly. He was kind, patient, and remembered what everyone liked. He put aside the end crust for Mr. Bell's dog without ever being asked, and he always wrapped Miss Ivy's loaf twice when it rained, because her paper goods would be in the same satchel. But there was also a quiet line around him, almost invisible, but firmly held. A sense that while he stood among the life of the village, some part of him remained elsewhere.
Perhaps that was why so many people noticed the chair. It stood in the far corner of the bakery beside the window, a simple wooden chair with a curved back and a woven seat. There was nothing special about it at first glance. It matched the room. It looked as though it belonged there, as though it had always belonged there.
And yet no one sat in it. Not children, not waiting customers, not Mrs. Fenwick when the line grew long, though she might have been entitled by age and temperament to claim it if anyone was. The chair remained empty. People glanced at it sometimes, then away. Thomas never moved it, never stacked trays on it, never hung his apron there or placed parcels on the seat. It was simply kept clear, day after day, as though reserved for a person who had only just stepped out and might return at any moment. Late in the morning, when the rush had eased, Mrs. Bell lingered by the counter while her husband waited outside with the bread. "It's funny," she said, looking not at Thomas but toward the window. "That corner catches the light so nicely." "It does. And that chair—" She stopped there, perhaps hearing her own thought before she finished it. Thomas folded the paper round her loaf with careful precision. Mrs. Bell cleared her throat. "Well, never mind. Thank you, Mr. Alder."
When she had gone, Thomas stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and looked toward the chair himself. The morning light had reached it now, laying a pale rectangle across the floorboards and climbing halfway up the woven seat. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beam, nothing more. And yet the sight of it held him longer than it should have. At last he looked away and began to wipe the counter. By 8 o'clock, the village was fully awake. The lane outside had taken on its daytime sounds: footsteps, bicycle wheels, the murmur of voices, the occasional call from one open window to another. The tailor's shutters were open now. Miss Ivy's paper shapes turned slightly in the light breeze. Sun, thin but determined, had begun to touch the upper bricks of the houses. Inside the bakery, the warmth remained.
There were fewer loaves on the rack now. Only 3 apple turnovers were left. The barley sugar jar had lowered by a noticeable inch. Thomas moved through the quiet after the rush with the same unhurried care he gave to everything else. He swept a little flour from the corner of the counter, refolded the cloth over the remaining buns, and adjusted the vase of yellow flowers so that it stood straighter in the light. Then the bell above the door gave another ring. Thomas looked up. A woman stood on the threshold, not stepping in at once, but pausing as though the room before her was both familiar and not. She wore a dark coat and held one gloved hand lightly on the door. Her face was turned slightly, taking in the shelves, the window, the bread racks, the chair in the corner. Thomas felt, for no reason he could have named, the room grow quieter. The woman met his eyes at last and gave the smallest nod. "Good morning," she said, and something in her voice made him straighten where he stood. Chapter 3. The Empty Chair. The woman did not step fully into the bakery at once. She remained near the doorway, one gloved hand still resting lightly against it. Somewhere nearby, a door closed with a soft, familiar weight. Inside, the bakery held its warmth. "Good morning," Thomas said. The woman inclined her head slightly.
Good morning." Her voice was calm, measured, not hurried, not uncertain. It was the kind of voice that did not ask for attention and yet seemed to gather it anyway. After a moment, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The bell gave its gentle ring, then settled. She stood just within the room, not moving towards the counter straight away. Instead, her gaze moved slowly, deliberately, as if she were reading something written not in words, but in the arrangement of things.
The shelves, the bread, the window, and then the chair. Her eyes rested there for a moment longer than anywhere else. Thomas noticed. He did not shift his stance or speak again, but his attention, quiet as it was, had sharpened. There was something in the way she looked at the room, not as a customer seeing it for the first time, but not entirely as someone returning either. "Is it too early?" she asked. "No," Thomas said. "We've been open a while." She nodded, though it seemed she already knew. At last, she stepped forward. Her coat was a deep blue, almost black in the morning light, and a scarf of softer colour was wrapped neatly at her neck. There was nothing particularly unusual about her appearance, and yet she carried herself in a way that made the room feel slightly altered, as though something long still had shifted, just enough to be noticed.
She stopped at the counter. "What do you have today?" she asked. Thomas turned slightly and gestured toward the chalkboard. Farmhouse loaves, seeded rolls, currant buns, apple turnovers, honey cake. She read the list carefully, though it was not long. "I'll take a loaf," she said, "and one of the turnovers. Of course." Thomas selected a loaf from the rack, one with a good crust, evenly baked, and wrapped it in paper. Then he chose a turnover, still faintly warm, and placed it beside the loaf, before folding the paper neatly around both. The woman watched his hands as he worked. "You've been here a long time," she said. It was not quite a question. Thomas tied the string and set the parcel on the counter. "Some years." She rested her fingers lightly on the edge of the paper, but did not pick it up yet. "It suits you," she said. Thomas met her gaze briefly, then looked back down at the counter. "I suppose it does." She reached into her coat pocket and placed the exact coins beside the parcel. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as though remembering something, the woman turned her head slightly, looking again toward the far corner of the bakery, toward the chair. "You keep that space clear," she said. Her tone was gentle, almost thoughtful, but there was a quiet certainty in it. Thomas followed her gaze, though he did not need to. "Yes, it's not for customers?" "No." She considered that. The morning light had shifted now, reaching farther across the floor. It touched the legs of the chair, the woven seat, the wall behind it. Dust motes drifted slowly in the brightness, rising and falling without direction. "It's a good place for a chair," she said. Thomas said nothing. The woman turned back to the counter, lifting the parcel at last. "Well," she said, "thank you." "You're welcome." She gave a small nod, then moved toward the door. Her steps were unhurried,
her movements precise without being deliberate. At the threshold she paused again. Not for long, only a moment. Then she stepped out into the lane, and the bell rang once more as the door closed behind her.
The bakery settled. There were no customers waiting. The sound of the village outside continued as it had before, steady, ordinary, unchanged. And yet something in the room felt different. Thomas stood behind the counter, his hands resting lightly on the wood. He did not move immediately. Instead, he looked toward the chair. The light had climbed higher now, filling more of the corner. The woven seat held it differently than the floorboards, catching it in small, uneven patterns. The back of the chair cast a faint shadow against the wall. Nothing had changed. And yet, the space did not feel quite as empty as it had before. Thomas drew a slow breath, then turned away. There was work to be done.
The rest of the morning passed as it always did, though not entirely as it always had. Customers came and went, loaves were sold, buns were wrapped, coins changed hands, conversations began and ended in their usual places. But Thomas found more than once that his attention wandered, not far, not in a way that disrupted his work, but just enough. He found himself listening more closely to the bell when the door opened, glancing up a moment sooner than he might have done, noticing the space near the entrance before looking at the person who had entered. Once, when no one was in the shop, he stepped away from the counter and crossed the room. He did not go directly to the chair. Instead, he adjusted a tray on the shelf beside it, then straightened a cloth that did not need straightening. Only then did he allow himself to stand near it. Up close it was as it had always been. The wood was smooth at the edges, worn slightly where hands had once rested. The woven seat had been repaired once, long ago, with care that showed in the evenness of the work. It was a good chair, a comfortable one. Thomas rested his hand lightly on the back. The wood was warm from the sun. He did not sit. After a moment, he stepped away and returned to the counter.
By midday, the bakery had grown quiet again. Only a few loaves remained. The last of the turnovers had been sold. The barley sugar jar was nearly half empty. Thomas moved through the familiar tasks of the late morning, clearing, wiping, preparing for the slower hours that followed the early rush. Outside, the light had strengthened. The pale blue of the morning had given way to something clearer, brighter. Shadows had shortened. The willow tree cast a gentle, shifting pattern across the cobbles. From time to time, Thomas found himself looking toward the door, not expecting, not quite, but aware of it in a way he had not been the day before. In the early afternoon, Mrs. Fenwick returned. She did not always come twice in one day, but when she did, she never remarked upon it, as though the matter required no explanation.
The bell rang. In she came. "I find," she said, removing her gloves, "that one bun is never sufficient." Thomas nodded. "No." She approached the counter, then paused, her gaze shifting briefly towards the far corner of the room. "That chair," she said. Thomas waited. "I've been meaning to ask," she continued, though it never seemed quite the moment. "No, no." She stepped closer to the counter, lowering her voice slightly, though there was no one else in the room. "Why does no one sit there?" Thomas folded a cloth once, then again. "It's not for sitting." Mrs. Fenwick considered this with care. "Everything is for sitting," she said, "if it's a chair." Thomas did not answer. She looked at him for a moment, then let the question rest. "2 buns," she said, returning to business, "and one of the seeded rolls." He wrapped them as neatly as ever. As she took the parcel, she glanced once more towards the chair, then back at Thomas. "It's a good place," she said. "Yes." She nodded, as though confirming something to herself, and left without pressing further.
The afternoon passed into its quieter rhythm. The bakery, though still warm, seemed to settle into a slower breath. The sounds from the lane softened. The light shifted again, turning warmer as it began its gradual movement toward evening. Thomas worked steadily, and yet, more than once, he found himself thinking of the woman, not of what she had said, there had been nothing unusual in her words, but in the way she had said them, and in the way she had looked at the room, as though she had been remembering something, or recognizing it. Late in the day, when the last customer had gone and the door had been closed, Thomas stood alone in the bakery. The light had softened now, turning golden where it touched the walls. The air held the fading warmth of the oven, the lingering scent of bread and pastry. He wiped the counter one final time, then set the cloth aside. For a moment he stood without moving. Then, slowly, he crossed the room. This time he went directly to the chair. He stood beside it, looking down at the woven seat, at the curve of the back, at the place where the light had rested earlier in the day. The room was very quiet. After a moment, he placed his hand on the chair again, not as one might test it, not as one might move it, but simply to feel that it was there. The wood had cooled now. The warmth of the day had faded from it. Thomas stood there for a long moment. Then, without sitting, without speaking, he turned and stepped away. He moved back toward the counter, toward the door, toward the familiar shape of his evening routine. Behind him, the chair remained as it always had been. Empty, but no longer unnoticed. The letter arrived the following morning. It did not come with the post. Thomas noticed that first, though only later did it seem to matter. He had opened the bakery as he always did, in darkness, with quiet hands and familiar movements. The shutters had been unlatched, the lamps lit, the oven coaxed gently into life. Flour had been measured, dough kneaded, the rhythm of the morning settling into place as it had done for years beyond counting. Nothing had been different, not at first. It was only when he stepped to the back door, just after setting the first dough to rise, that he saw it. a single envelope resting on the worn stone step. It lay just to one side of the threshold, as though placed there with care rather than dropped. The paper was plain, cream-coloured, neither new nor particularly old. No seal, no stamp, no mark of any kind.
Thomas stood still for a moment. The air outside carried the quiet chill of early morning. The lane behind the bakery, narrower, less travelled, remained empty. No footsteps, no movement, no sign of anyone having passed through. He bent and picked up the envelope. It was light. There was something inside, a single sheet perhaps, but nothing more. No weight of enclosure, no thickness that might suggest more than a few words. He turned it once in his hands. There was no name written on it, no address, no indication at all of who it was for, and yet it had been placed precisely at his door. Thomas stepped back inside and closed the door behind him.
For a moment he stood in the quiet of the bakery, the envelope held lightly between his fingers. The oven gave a soft crack behind him. Somewhere above, a pipe shifted as the building began to wake. He turned the envelope over once more. Still nothing. Then, without hurry, he placed it on the corner of the table. There was time. The morning continued. Dough was kneaded, trays were prepared. The oven warmed steadily, filling the room with its quiet, familiar heat. The work required his attention, and he gave it, moving through each task with the same care he always had. And yet the envelope remained. He did not look at it often, not directly, but he was aware of it, of its presence on the table, just within reach. A small, still thing, waiting without impatience. At last, when the first loaves had been shaped and set aside, Thomas wiped his hands on his apron and stepped toward it. He picked it up again. The paper felt ordinary, but there was something in the stillness of it that held his attention. After a moment, he opened it.
Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. He unfolded it carefully and looked at what was written there. The handwriting was neat, unhurried, and unmistakably deliberate. There were only a few lines. "You are still there. I wondered if you might be. The mornings look the same." Thomas did not move. He read the words once, then again. There was nothing more. No name, no signature, no explanation. He stood at the table, the paper held lightly in his hands, the quiet of the bakery pressing gently around him. The oven cracked softly. A faint draught stirred the edge of the page. Thomas lowered the letter and looked at the empty space beneath the final line, as though something more might appear if he waited long enough. But it did not. There are some things that arrive in a life
not with noise or urgency, but with a quiet that feels larger than it should. This was one of them. Thomas folded the paper again. He did not return it to the envelope immediately. Instead, he stood for a moment, his gaze unfocused, resting somewhere between the table and the far wall. The words were simple. Not a question, not quite a statement, and yet they carried something with them, something just beyond their meaning. You are still there. The phrase settled in his thoughts, not heavily, but with a kind of persistence. He placed the letter back into the envelope and set it aside. Then he returned to his work. The bakery filled with warmth as the morning moved forward. Bread rose, pastries baked. The familiar scents of flour, butter, and spice settled into the air. Customers arrived, as they always did. Mr. Pike came first, his routine unchanged, his order spoken with the same quiet certainty. "Morning, Thomas." "Morning, Mr. Pike." "Cold again?" "A little." There was no mention of the letter, no reason there should have been. Mrs. Fenwick followed, her coat buttoned neatly, her expression composed. "2 buns," she said, "and 1 turnover." "Of course. You've made them well today?" "Thank you." Her gaze moved, briefly, toward the corner of the room, toward the chair, then back again. Nothing else was said. The morning continued. Voices came and went. Coins changed hands. The bell above the door rang, settled, rang again. And yet, beneath it all, the letter remained. Not in sight. Thomas had placed it beneath a folded cloth on the edge of the table, but present nonetheless. He found himself thinking of it in small moments, while cutting a loaf, while wrapping a parcel, while waiting for the oven to settle between trays. The mornings look the same. He had not thought of his mornings as something that could be observed. They simply were, had always been, hadn't they? Late in the morning, when the rush had passed and the bakery had grown quiet again, Thomas stepped away from the counter. He crossed the room slowly. This time, his attention did not move to the shelves, or the window, or the trays waiting to be cleaned. It went without hesitation to the chair. He stood beside it. The light had reached it again, though at a slightly different angle than the day before. The woven seat caught it unevenly, small patterns of brightness shifting with the movement of the morning. Thomas rested his hand lightly on the back. The wood was warm. He looked at the chair for a long moment. Then, almost without intending to, he spoke. "They do." The words were quiet, barely more than breath. The room did not answer. He stepped away after a moment
and returned to the table. The cloth lay where he had left it. He lifted it and took out the envelope again. This time he did not unfold the letter. Instead, he turned it over in his hands, as he had done before. There was still no name, no mark, no indication of its origin, only the knowledge that it had been placed there, deliberately, quietly, in the hour before he had opened the door. Thomas set it down again, but not beneath the cloth this time. He left it where it could be seen.
In the late afternoon, Miss Ivy returned. She stood at the counter, selecting a small loaf, her fingers brushing lightly over the crust, as though assessing it by touch alone. "You've had a letter," she said. Thomas looked up. "Yes, I thought so." She did not ask how she knew. Thomas did not ask why she had said it. Miss Ivy smiled faintly, not unkindly. "There's a way the room changes," she said, "when something arrives." Thomas considered this. "I see." She nodded, as though that was sufficient. "Good day, Mr. Alder." "Good day, Miss Ivy." She left with her parcel, the bell ringing softly behind her. As evening approached, the light in the bakery shifted once more. The warmth remained, but the brightness softened through his closing routine. The remaining bread was covered, the counter wiped, the oven allowed to rest. At last he stood alone in the room. The letter remained on the table. He looked at it for a long moment. Then slowly he crossed the room and picked it up. This time he did unfold it again. He read the words once more. "You are still there. I wondered if you might be. The mornings look the same." Thomas stood very still. Then with deliberate care he folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beneath the counter. Not hidden, not put away entirely, but set aside, for now. He turned the key in the front door and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, carrying the quiet end of the day. The lane had softened into its slower rhythm once more. Windows glowed faintly. Voices were lower. The world seemed to be settling. Thomas stood for a moment on the step. Then he looked briefly down the length of Willow Lane. Nothing unusual. Nothing changed. And yet, after a moment, he turned back inside. Behind him, the bakery held its warmth, and somewhere within it now, quietly waiting, was the beginning of something not yet understood. The next morning began as all the others had. The light appeared first, softly, gradually, filling the bakery in slow layers of gold and amber. The shutters opened. The lamps were lit. The oven was woken with careful hands and quiet patience. Thomas moved through each part of it as he always had. And yet something in the rhythm had shifted. Not enough to be seen, but enough to be felt. He woke a little earlier than usual. Not by intention,
but because his sleep had thinned toward morning, as though something had been waiting just beneath it. He lay for a moment in the dim room above the shop, listening. The building was quiet, the same as always. And yet, he sat up. There was no reason to remain where he was.
When he came down into the bakery, the air felt cooler than it had the day before. Or perhaps he noticed it more. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, as he always did, letting the room settle around him. The table, the shelves, the oven. And then, without meaning to, his gaze moved to the drawer beneath the counter. The letter rested there, out of sight, but not entirely out of mind. Thomas stood for a moment longer than usual. Then he stepped forward and began.
The shutters opened with their familiar creak. The lamps warmed the room. The oven was coaxed into life. "Easy now," he murmured. The words came as naturally as breath. He set the bowl on the table and gathered the flour. His hands moved as they always did, steady, certain, guided by long practice. But as the flour fell into the bowl, something stirred. Not in the room, not in the work, but in him. It began with the scent. Flour had always smelled the same, clean, soft, faintly warm. It was not a strong smell, not something that demanded attention. But this morning it seemed to hold something more, something just beyond itself. Thomas paused, only for a moment. Then he added the water, the yeast, the salt. His hands entered the mixture. Fold, press, turn. Fold, press, turn. The rhythm settled. The dough resisted, then softened, just as it always had. And yet, as he worked, the scent deepened. Or perhaps it unfolded, and with it came something else. A memory. Not a full one, not a clear one, just a fragment. A table, different from this one. Darker wood, rougher edges, sunlight instead of lamplight. Hands, not his, or perhaps his but younger, moving differently, quicker, less certain. A voice, close by, saying something. Thomas stopped. His hands rested in the dough. The memory did not complete itself. It lingered, just out of reach. Then it faded. The oven cracked softly behind him. The sound returned him to the mum. Thomas drew a slow breath and continued. Fold, press, turn. The rhythm resumed. The moment passed. But something had changed. When the dough was set aside to rise, he began the second mixture. Butter, milk, currants. The scent grew warmer, richer, filling the room with a softness that settled into the wood, the walls, the air itself. Thomas worked more slowly now, not deliberately,
but because something in him had begun to listen. As the butter melted into the dough, another fragment came. A kitchen again, warmer this time, brighter. The same darker table, flour dusted across it, a hand brushing it aside. Laughter, quiet but clear. Not his, someone else's.
Thomas's hands paused again. The dough rested beneath them, soft, yielding. He did not try to follow the memory. He did not reach for it. He simply stood there, aware of it as it passed through him. Then it too was gone. He finished the dough and covered it. The cloth settled over it gently, as though nothing had happened. But the room felt different now, not changed, but opened. Thomas moved to the pastry bench. The marble surface was cool beneath his hands. He dusted it lightly with flour and began to prepare the apples. Knife against fruit, a clean, steady sound. The scent rose at once, sharp, fresh, green. It cut through the warmth of the room, and with it came something else.
A window, open, wind moving through it, the sound of leaves. He stopped. The knife rested in his hand. The apple lay half sliced on the board. This time the memory lingered a moment longer. Not enough to form into something whole, but enough to be recognized as something that had once been known. Thomas set the knife down. He did not move. The bakery was quiet around him. The oven breathed its steady heat. The early morning held itself just outside the windows. Then slowly he picked up the knife again and continued. The pastries were shaped, the trays arranged. The oven opened. Warmth filled the air. Everything moved forward, as it always did. But the rhythm was no longer untouched.
When the first trays were set inside the oven, Thomas stepped back. He wiped his hands. Then, without quite deciding to, he crossed the room. The drawer beneath the counter stood where it always had, unremarkable, closed. He opened it. The letter lay exactly where he had placed it, folded once, still, waiting. He lifted it, unfolded it, read the words again. You are still there. I wondered if you might be. The mornings look the same. Thomas stood very still. This time the words did not settle as they had before. They moved. They reached. The mornings look the same. He looked up, at the bakery, at the table, at the shelves, at the oven. Yes, they did. And yet he folded the letter again, but did not return it to the drawer. Instead, he placed it on the table, where it could be seen. The morning continued. Customers came. Voices filled the room. The bell rang. Bread was sold. Coins passed across the counter. And through it all, the work remained steady. But the memories did not entirely fade. They came in fragments, not constant, not overwhelming, just enough. A gesture, a sound, the way flour moved in the air, the way the dough felt beneath his hands, each one carrying something with it, something not yet clear, but no longer entirely hidden. At one point, as he wrapped a loaf for Mr. Pike, the older man paused. "You're quiet today," he said. Thomas looked up. "I am?" Mr. Pike nodded. "Thinking, then, perhaps?" Mr. Pike adjusted his parcel under his arm. "Best not to rush that," he said. "No?" And then he left.
Later, Mrs. Fenwick arrived. She stood at the counter, watching Thomas as he folded the paper around her buns. "You've changed something," she said. Thomas glanced up. "No." She tilted her head slightly. "It feels different." Thomas said nothing. Mrs. Fenwick looked around the room, her gaze settling briefly on the letter resting on the table. She did not comment on it. Instead, she gave a small nod. "Well," she said, "it's not a bad thing." She took her parcel and left. The day moved forward. The light shifted. The warmth of the oven softened. The rush passed. By the time the afternoon quiet settled in, the bakery felt almost as it had before. Almost. Thomas stood at the table. The letter lay where he had placed it. He rested his hands lightly on the wood. The memories had not returned in the same way. They had faded again, but not completely.
They had left something behind. Not images, not words, but a sense of something unfinished. He looked toward the chair. The light had reached it again, different now, lower, warmer. For a moment, the two things, the chair and the letter, seemed to belong to the same thought, though he could not have said why. Thomas drew a slow breath. Then he turned away. There was still work to be done. But as the day moved toward its close, and the last of the light settled across the floor, one thing had become quietly certain. The mornings might look the same, but they were no longer untouched by what had come before. And whatever had been set in motion had not yet finished.
Chapter 6. The Woman with the Blue Scarf. The woman returned 2 mornings later. Not early, not late. At an hour that suggested neither intention nor accident. Thomas noticed her before the bell rang. He had been standing at the counter, folding paper for the next customer, when something, not a sound, not quite a movement, drew his attention to the window. Her reflection appeared there first, faint against the light, before she stepped into view and opened the door. The bell gave its soft, familiar note. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." This time, she did not pause at the threshold. She stepped inside as though the decision had already been made.
The bakery held its usual warmth. The morning had settled into its steady rhythm,
bread cooling on racks, the quiet murmur of the oven, the faint scent of cinnamon lingering in the air. Nothing in the room had changed, and yet Thomas felt the same subtle shift as before. The woman moved towards the counter, her gaze passing once again over the room, not searching, not wondering, simply noticing. She wore the same coat, the same scarf, blue, though in the morning light it carried a softer tone, almost grey at the edges. There was something careful in the way it was wrapped, as though it had been done out of habit rather than thought. "I thought I might come back," she said. Thomas nodded once. "You're welcome to. I hoped that might be the case." Her eyes moved briefly to the table. The letter lay there, just as Thomas had left it. She did not look at it directly.
But she had seen it. "I'll have the same," she said after a moment, "if that's all right." "Of course." Thomas turned to the bread rack, selecting a loaf without needing to consider which one. His movements were steady, unchanged, though he was aware, quietly, steadily, of her presence across from him. "And the turnover?" he asked. "Yes." He wrapped the items neatly, the paper folding into itself with quiet precision. When he placed the parcel on the counter, she did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she rested her hand lightly beside it. "You've kept everything the same," she said. Thomas met her gaze. "Yes." She nodded, as though confirming something she had expected. "I wondered if you would."
He did not ask why. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The bakery held its quiet. Outside, a cart passed slowly along the lane. The sound drifted in, softened by the open air, then faded again. The woman glanced toward the corner of the room. The chair stood as it always had, unoccupied, unmoved. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned back. "You've taken care of it," she said. Thomas followed her gaze again, though more briefly this time.
"Yes." There was a pause. Then she asked very simply, "Why?" The question did not carry weight in the way it might have, spoken by someone else. It was not pressing, not demanding. It rested between them lightly. Thomas considered it. Not the answer, that had long been settled whether spoken or not, but the act of answering. At last he said, "It belongs where it is." The woman's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened. "Yes," she said, "it does." She reached for the parcel then, lifting it from the counter. Her fingers lingered slightly against the paper, as though she were feeling its shape rather than simply holding it. "Things don't always stay where they belong," she said. Thomas did not reply. The words settled in the room, quiet and unhurried. A customer entered then, a man Thomas knew only in passing, and the moment shifted. The woman stepped slightly aside to allow space, though she did not move toward the door. She remained within the room, present. Thomas served the man as he always did. Bread was chosen, wrapped, paid for. A brief exchange. Nothing out of the ordinary.
And yet, even as he spoke, part of his awareness remained elsewhere. Not distracted, not divided, simply extended. When the man had gone, the bell settling behind him, the quiet returned. The woman had not moved far. She stood near the window now, looking out onto Willow Lane. The light had strengthened since she arrived, laying a pale brightness across the cobbles and catching in the branches of the willow tree. "It hasn't changed much," she said. "No, that's rare." Thomas folded a cloth on the counter. "Yes." She turned slightly, her gaze moving back into the room.
"It's a good thing," she added. "Mostly." "Mostly." Another pause. Not uncomfortable, not empty, simply there. At last, she stepped back toward the counter. "You're wondering who I am," she said. It was not a question. Thomas met her gaze. "I am." She nodded, as though that too had been expected.
"I thought you might be." There was the faintest suggestion of a smile, not quite formed, but present nonetheless. But not enough to ask. Thomas did not deny it. The woman adjusted her grip on the parcel. "For now," she said, "it's enough that I've come back." Thomas inclined his head slightly. "For now." She moved toward the door. This time she did not pause at the threshold, but just before stepping out, she turned back once more. Her gaze moved briefly to the table, to the letter, then to Thomas. "You read it," she said. "Yes, and?" Thomas considered. "It says very little." She nodded. "It does." Another small pause. Then, more quietly, she added, "It says enough." She opened the door. The bell rang, and she stepped out into the morning. The bakery settled once more, but the quiet was not the same as it had been before. Thomas stood behind the counter for a long moment. Then, slowly, he crossed the room. The letter remained where he had left it.
He looked at it, not with uncertainty, not with hesitation, but with a kind of recognition that had not been there before. The mornings look the same. He understood the words differently now, not as observation, but as something closer to memory. After a moment, he reached out and folded the letter once more. This time, when he placed it down, it was not at the edge of the table, but nearer the center. He turned, almost without thinking, toward the chair. The light had shifted again, resting more fully across the seat. It no longer seemed like an absence, not entirely. Thomas stood there, looking at it. Then quietly he said, "She noticed." The room held the words. The oven gave a soft, steady breath, and for the first time, the space did not feel as though it were waiting alone.
Chapter 7. The Long Way Home. That evening, Thomas closed the bakery a little later than usual. Not by much, just enough for the light to have shifted from afternoon gold into something softer, more settled. The kind of light that did not belong entirely to day or night, but rested somewhere between the two. He finished his routine as he always did. The remaining bread was covered,
the counter wiped clean, the oven left to cool in its own quiet way. Nothing had been forgotten, nothing left undone. And yet, when he stood at the door with the key in his hand, there was a pause, a small one, but noticeable. For many years, Thomas had followed the same path home.
Not a long walk, not a complicated one. From the bakery door, along the curve of Willow Lane, past the tailor's shop, beyond the stationer's, and then a short turning that led back toward the small rooms above the shop where he lived. He could have walked it in darkness, in rain, in thought, and often had. But this evening he did not turn where he usually would. He stepped out into the lane and closed the door behind him, the lock settling with a soft, familiar click. The air was cool, not cold, but carrying the quiet edge of evening. The scent of the day lingered faintly, wood smoke, damp stone, the last warmth of sun held in brick. The willow tree stirred above him. Its long branches shifted gently, catching what little breeze remained. Thomas stood for a moment. Then, instead of turning toward home, he continued along the lane. It was not a decision made all at once, more a continuation than a change, a step followed by another. The lane stretched ahead, curving out of its familiar centre. Thomas walked at an easy pace, not slow, not hurried, simply steady. The further he went, the less familiar the details became. Not entirely unknown. He had passed this way before, of course, but not often, not in years. The houses here were set a little farther apart, their gardens slightly larger, though still modest. Low stone walls edged the path, some carefully kept, others softened by moss and time. A small gate stood open, where a path led toward a row of cottages beyond, their windows glowing faintly with lamplight. Thomas noticed these things as he passed, not as one searching, but as one allowing the world to be seen. The sounds were different here, too, quieter, more spread out.
A voice from one house did not carry as easily to the next. Footsteps were less frequent. The rhythm of the lane had loosened, becoming something less structured, less known. After a time, the cobbled path gave way to a narrower road, not paved in quite the same way. The stones were older here, more uneven, with grass growing faintly between them in places where the wear of footsteps had softened. Thomas continued. The sky above had deepened. The pale blue of late afternoon had begun to fade, replaced by a softer tone, not yet dark, but moving toward it. A single star had appeared, faint, but present.
He reached a small rise in the road, not steep, just enough to shift the view. From there he could see beyond the cluster of houses, past the last of the gardens, to where the land opened slightly. Fields lay beyond, quiet and still, their edges marked by low hedges and narrow paths worn by years of passing feet. Thomas stopped. He had not meant to come this far, or perhaps he had. The air felt different here, wider, less contained. The scent of the bakery did not reach this far, nor the sound of the village in the same way. Everything seemed to settle more deeply, as though the world itself were taking a slower breath. He stood there for a moment,
then stepped forward again. A path led down from the rise, narrow but clear. Thomas followed it. The ground beneath his feet shifted from stone to packed earth, then to something softer still. Grass brushed lightly against his shoes as he walked. There was no one else there. No movement, no voices, only the quiet presence of the land at the end of the day. He did not walk far, only enough to feel the distance from the lane, from the bakery, from the routine that had shaped his days for so long. After a while, he stopped again.
The sky had deepened further now. The first true signs of evening were settling in. Shadows had lengthened and softened, blending into one another until the shapes of things became less defined. Thomas looked out across the fields. He did not think of anything in particular, not in words, but there was a sense, faint but steady, that something within him was adjusting, not changing, not yet, but shifting. The memory from the morning returned, quietly, not in detail, not in image, but in feeling. The darker table.
The sense of something once known. Thomas stood very still. The air moved lightly around him. The first sound of an evening bird carried across the open space, then faded. After a moment he spoke, not loudly, not as if expecting an answer, just enough for the words to exist. I remember. The sound settled into the quiet. Nothing responded, but something faint and distant seemed to settle within him. He remained there a little while longer.
Then, as the light began to fade more fully, he turned. The walk back felt different, not shorter, not longer, but clearer. The path led him once more to the rise, then back toward the houses, the gardens, the narrow road that became cobbled again as it returned to Willow Lane. Lights had appeared in the windows now, warm, steady. The village had settled into its evening rhythm. As Thomas reached the centre of the lane, the bakery came into view. The windows were dark now, the sign still. The door closed. Everything as it should be. He paused outside it, just for a moment. Then he continued past, up
the short turning to the door that led to the rooms above. He unlocked it, stepped inside, and closed it behind him. The building was quiet again, as it had been that morning, as it had been every morning before. Thomas stood in the dim light of the hallway. Then slowly he made his way upstairs. Later, as he lay in bed, the room dark around him, the events of the day did not replay in his mind in any clear sequence. There were no firm conclusions, no sudden understanding, only the sense of having stepped, however slightly, beyond something that had once held him in place. And somewhere in that quiet, as sleep began to settle, one thought remained. The mornings might look the same, but the days no longer ended where they once had.
Chapter 8. The Second Letter. The second letter came 3 mornings later. Thomas noticed it sooner this time. Not because it was placed differently. It lay on the same worn stone step at the back door, just to one side, as though set there with quiet care, but because he was already aware of the possibility. He had begun to look. Not deliberately, not each morning, but often enough. The day had begun as usual. The light had appeared in the window, the shutters had been opened, the oven had been coaxed gently into life. "Easy now," he had said, as he always did. And yet, beneath the familiar rhythm, there had been a quiet attentiveness.
When he stepped to the back door, he saw it at once. The envelope, plain, unmarked, waiting. He stood for a moment before picking it up. The air outside was still. The narrow lane behind the bakery remained empty, holding the same early morning quiet as before. No sign of who had come, no trace of footsteps or sound. Thomas bent and lifted the envelope. It was the same as the first, or near enough. The same paper, the same careful stillness. But this time he did not turn it over. He did not examine it. He already knew what he would find. He stepped back inside and closed the door. The bakery held its quiet. The oven breathed its low, steady warmth. The day had not yet fully begun. Thomas walked to the table. The first letter lay where he had left it the night before, near the centre of the wood. He placed the second envelope beside it. For a moment he stood looking at the two of them. Then he opened the new one. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was the same, neat, deliberate, unhurried. This time there were more words. "I thought you might notice. You always did notice small things, though not always at the time." Thomas read the lines once, then again.
The bakery seemed to hold itself still around him. You always did notice small things. He lowered the page slightly.
The words settled differently than the first letter had. Less distant, closer. He placed the second letter on the table beside the first. The two sheets rested there, separate but connected. For a moment, Thomas did not move. His hands remained on the edge of the table. The light in the room had begun to shift, softening as the morning approached. Then, slowly, he returned to his work. The dough was prepared, flour measured, water added, yeast stirred into life. But the rhythm had changed.
Not broken, not lost, but altered. As he began to knead, the words remained with him. You always did notice small things. Fold, press, turn. Fold, press, turn. The dough softened beneath his hands. The oven warmed the room. The familiar scents began to rise, and with them, something else. A memory. This time, it came more clearly.
Not complete, but fuller than before. A window, open. Curtains moving in a light breeze. Sunlight across a table. The same darker wood. A hand brushing flour aside. And a voice. You're not paying attention. Thomas stopped. His hands rested on the dough. The memory held. You miss things when you don't pay attention. The voice again, gentle, not sharp, but certain. He stood very still. Then the oven gave a soft crack behind him. The moment shifted, the memory loosened, and then it was gone. Thomas drew a slow breath. His hands remained where they were for a moment longer. Then, quietly, he resumed. Fold, press, turn. But now the rhythm carried something with it. Recognition. The morning moved forward. The work continued. Customers came. Voices filled the space. The bell rang and settled. But the letters remained on the table, not hidden, not set aside, present. At one point, as Thomas wrapped a loaf, Mrs. Fenwick paused at the counter. Her gaze moved to the papers. "You've had another," she said. Thomas nodded. Yes. She did not ask to read it. She did not ask who it was from. Instead, she looked at him. "You look as though you remember something," she said. Thomas considered. "I might." Mrs. Fenwick gave a small nod. That's usually how it begins. She took her parcel and left without further comment. Later, Miss Ivy came in. She stood at the counter, her eyes briefly resting on the letters. "Ah," she said softly. Thomas looked up. "Yes." Thomas did not ask what she meant. Miss Ivy smiled faintly. "They often are," she added, and selected her usual loaf. The day unfolded as it always did, and yet beneath it all something had shifted again. The letters were no longer simply present. They were moving, not physically, but in what they carried. By the afternoon, the bakery had grown quiet once more. The light had changed, warming as it moved across the floor. The chair in the corner held it gently, as it had the day before. Thomas stood at the table. The 2 letters lay before him. He looked at them, not reading now, not searching, simply seeing. You are still there. The mornings look the same. You always did notice small things. He understood something then. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. The letters were not asking, not explaining. They were reminding. Thomas reached out and placed one hand lightly on the table. The wood felt steady beneath his palm, familiar. After a moment he gathered both letters and folded them carefully. This time he did not place them in the drawer, nor did he leave them in the open. Instead, he set them beside the vase of yellow flowers on the counter, where they could be seen, but also belonged. The afternoon passed into evening. The final customers came and went. The bakery settled once more into its quiet. As Thomas moved through his closing routine, his thoughts did not return to the letters in the same way. They were no longer something separate. They had become part of the room, part of the day. And as he stood at the door, preparing to step out into the evening once more, he found himself pausing again. Not from uncertainty, but from awareness. The world beyond the bakery did not feel as distant as it had before. The lane, the path, the wider spaces beyond, all of it felt available. Thomas stepped outside. The evening air met him, cool and steady. The willow tree stirred above. The village moved quietly toward night, and somewhere within him something that had once been still had begun, gently, to move again. Chapter 9. The Story Behind the Bread. The woman came again the next morning. This time Thomas did not notice her in the window, nor did he hear her footsteps before the bell. She entered as any other customer might, quietly, without drawing attention, and yet, as before, the room seemed to recognize her presence before anything else did. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." There was no pause at the door now, no hesitation. She stepped fully into the bakery and moved toward the counter, her gaze resting briefly on the letters beside the vase of yellow flowers. "You've kept them out," she said. "Yes." She nodded. "That's good." The morning had already begun its steady rhythm. Bread cooled on the racks. The oven held its quiet warmth. A few early customers had come and gone. Nothing unusual, nothing changed, and yet something had settled between them now. Not familiarity exactly, but something close to it. "The same again?" Thomas asked. "If you have it." "I do." He selected a loaf, then a turnover, wrapping them with the same careful precision as before. This time she watched not only his hands, but his face as he worked. "You've been thinking," she said. Thomas tied the string around the parcel. "Yes, and remembering?" He placed the parcel on the counter, a little. She rested her hand lightly beside it. "That's more than before." A customer entered then, Mr. Pike, with his usual quiet presence, and the moment shifted. Thomas served him as he always did. "Morning, Thomas." "Morning. Still cold?" "For now." Mr. Pike nodded, took his parcel and left. The bell rang. The quiet returned. The woman had not moved. She stood where she had been, her attention now resting more fully on Thomas. "You remembered something yesterday," she said. It was not a question. Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, as though to check the bread racks, though there was nothing there that required checking. At last he said, "A voice." The woman's expression did not change. "What did it say?" Thomas considered. Then quietly he replied, "That I wasn't paying attention." For a moment neither of them spoke. The bakery held its stillness. The woman nodded, almost to herself. "That sounds right." Thomas looked at her. "You know it?" "Yes." "How?" She did not answer that directly. Instead, she asked, "Do you remember where you were?" Thomas turned his gaze toward the table. The letters lay where he had placed them, beside the flowers. "A kitchen," he said. "Yours?" He hesitated. "No." The word settled between them, not heavy, but certain. The woman drew in a small breath, then let it go. "That's something," she said. Thomas rested his hands lightly on the counter. The wood felt steady beneath his palms. "I don't remember how I came here," he said. The words were quiet, measured, as though he had not said them aloud in a very long time. The woman did not interrupt. "I remember baking," he continued, "not learning, just doing it, as though I already knew." She nodded. "And before that?" Thomas shook his head. "Nothing clear." The bell rang again. A young man entered, nodded briefly, and asked for a loaf. Thomas served him, wrapped the bread, took the coins. The motions were familiar, grounding. When the man had gone, the woman was still there, waiting, but not pressing. "There was someone," Thomas said. The words came slowly, not forced, but uncovered. The woman's gaze remained steady. "Yes." Thomas looked toward the chair. The light had begun to reach it again, though only faintly at this hour. "They used to sit there," he said. The words seemed to settle differently in the room, as though they had been waiting to be spoken. The woman followed his gaze. "Yes," she said. Thomas's brow furrowed slightly. "Not in confusion, but in the effort of holding something just beyond reach. "They would talk while I worked," he said. "About what?" "Small things." He paused, then added, "and important ones." The woman's expression softened. "That sounds like them." Thomas looked at her again. "You knew them?"
This time it was a statement. The woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped away from the counter and moved slowly toward the chair. Her hand brushed lightly against the back as she reached it. She did not sit, not yet. "They noticed things," she said quietly. "The way you shape the dough, the way you listen without answering straight away, the way you keep things as they were." Thomas watched her. The room felt very still. "They thought it mattered," she continued.
"The small things." Thomas's gaze shifted to the letters, then back to her. "They said that," he said. "Yes." A long pause followed, not empty, but full of something unspoken. At last Thomas said, "I left." The words were simple, but they carried something with them. The woman's hand rested on the chair. "Yes. I don't remember why." "You wouldn't." Thomas's expression tightened slightly. "Why not?" The woman turned to face him fully. "For the same reason you forgot the rest." The answer did not explain, not fully, but it did not feel untrue. Thomas stood very still. The bakery around him remained unchanged, the oven steady, the bread cooling, the light shifting slowly across the floor. And yet, "You came back," he said. The woman inclined her head slightly. "Yes." "To remind me?" "Not exactly." She moved back toward the counter, her steps quiet. "I came to see if you were still here." Thomas glanced at the letters. "I am." She followed his gaze. "Yes," she said, "you are." Another pause. Then, more softly, she added, "And now you're beginning to remember." Thomas drew a slow breath. The room felt different again, not unsettled, but opened. He looked once more toward the chair, then back at her. "Who are you?" he asked. This time the question was clear. The woman held his gaze. For a moment it seemed as though she might answer, but instead she said, "Someone who used to sit there." She turned slightly, picking up the parcel from the counter. "And someone who wondered," she added, "if you ever would again." Thomas did not move. The bell rang as she opened the door. Morning light entered the room. She stepped outside, then paused. Without turning back, she said, "You don't have to rush it." And then she was gone. The bakery settled into its quiet once more. Thomas stood behind the counter, the letters beside the flowers, the chair in the corner, the warmth of the oven, everything as it had been, and yet no longer the same. Chapter 10. A seat no longer empty. The next morning arrived more quietly than the others. Not in the way of sound. The bakery still woke as it always did, the light rising slowly, the oven answering Thomas's careful hands. But in the way the day seemed to hold itself, as though waiting. Thomas noticed it from the beginning, not as a thought, but as a feeling. He moved through his routine with the same steady rhythm. Shutters opened, lamps lit, the oven warmed. "Easy now," he murmured. The words carried as they always had, but this morning they seemed to settle more deeply into the room. The letters remained on the counter, beside the vase of yellow flowers, unmoved. Thomas did not read them again. Not that morning. He did not need to. They had already begun their work. As he kneaded the first dough, the rhythm returned easily. Fold, press, turn. Fold, press, turn. But now the memories came more gently, not as fragments, not as interruptions, but as something that moved alongside the work. A hand resting on the table. A voice speaking without urgency. The sound of quiet laughter. Thomas did not stop this time. He did not pause. He let the rhythm carry both the work and the memory together. The morning unfolded. Customers came and went. Mr. Pike arrived, as he always did, and made his usual observations. "Looks like it'll hold," he said, glancing at the sky through the window. Yes. Mrs. Fenwick followed, her coat buttoned neatly, her expression composed. "You've settled," she said. Thomas looked up. Yes. She nodded once, as though that was all that needed to be said. The hours passed. The bakery filled, then quieted. The warmth remained. The light shifted. And through it all, the chair stood where it always had, unoccupied, until the bell above the door rang. Thomas looked up. The woman stood there. She did not pause this time, did not linger at the threshold. She stepped inside as though the space already belonged to her, as though the decision to enter had been made long before the door opened. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." There was something different in her voice, not changed, but settled. She moved toward the counter, her gaze passing over the room as it had before, the bread, the table, the letters, and then the chair. Her eyes rested there, but only briefly. "I won't stay long today," she said. "That's all right." Thomas waited, not for her order, not for her words, but for something else. She stepped closer to the counter. "I don't need anything," she said. Thomas nodded. The bakery held its quiet. Outside, the village moved through its morning. A cart passed. Voices drifted. The willow tree stirred. Inside, nothing moved. Then, without announcement, without hesitation, the woman turned and walked to the chair. Thomas did not speak. She reached it and rested her hand lightly on the back, the same way she had done before. But this time she did not stop there. She pulled it back slightly. The legs made a soft sound against the wooden floor, a sound that had not been heard in that room for a very long time. And then she sat. The movement was simple, unremarkable, the kind of thing that happens without notice in any other place. But here it changed everything. The chair held her easily, as though it had been waiting, as though it remembered. Thomas stood behind the counter. His hands rested on the wood, but his attention had moved entirely across the room. The light had reached the chair fully now. It settled across her shoulders, the back of the seat, the floor beneath her feet. She did not look at him immediately. Instead, she looked around the room slowly. "This is where I used to sit," she said. The words were not uncertain, not tentative. They belonged. Thomas did not answer. He did not need to. The truth of it had already begun to settle. She rested her hands lightly in her lap. The parcel she had not taken lay still on the counter behind her. "You worked," she continued, "early, always early." Thomas drew a slow breath. "I talked," she said, "more than I should have." A faint smile touched her expression. "You listened," she added, "even when you pretended not to." Thomas felt something shift, not sharply, not suddenly, but with a quiet certainty. "I remember," he said. The words came without effort. The woman nodded. "I know." She turned her head slightly then, looking at him for the first time since she had sat down. "It took you a while," she said. Thomas's expression softened, though only slightly. "Yes." Another pause. Not empty, full. "You left," she said. The words were gentle, but they did not avoid their meaning. Thomas did not look away. "Yes." "You don't remember why?" "No." She studied him for a moment, not searching, not judging, simply seeing. "That's all right," she said. Thomas felt the words settle. They did not explain, but they did not need to. The room held them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The bakery remained as it always had, the oven warm, the bread cooling, the light steady. And yet something had changed. The chair was no longer empty, and the space it had held, the quiet, waiting absence, had been filled, not with something new, but with something returned. At last the woman stood. The chair shifted softly as she rose. She did not push it fully back into place, not exactly. It remained slightly angled, as though it might be used again. She walked back to the counter and picked up the parcel. "This is better," she said. Thomas nodded. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment longer, then she smiled. Not fully, not brightly, but enough. "I'll come again," she said. "I know." She turned and walked to the door. The bell rang as she opened it. Morning light entered. She stepped outside, and this time she did not pause. The door closed behind her.
The bakery settled. Thomas stood where he was. Then, slowly, he crossed the room. He reached the chair. For a moment he stood beside it, looking down at the seat, at the place where she had just been. Then, very gently, he adjusted it, not back to where it had been, but into a place where it remained part of the room, part of the day, part of what would come next. Thomas rested his hand briefly on the back. Then he turned and returned to the counter. The bakery held its warmth. The light moved softly across the floor. The letters rested beside the flowers, and for the first time in many years, nothing in the room felt as though it were waiting alone. Chapter 11. The next morning did not begin any differently. The light appeared in the window as it always had, softly, gradually, filling the bakery in quiet layers. The shutters opened, the lamps were lit, the oven was coaxed gently into life. "Easy now," Thomas said. The words were the same, the movements the same, the rhythm unchanged. And yet the morning felt different. It was not something that could be pointed to. Nothing had been added, nothing removed, but the space within the day had shifted. Thomas noticed it as he stood at the bottom of the stairs, pausing as he always did before stepping fully into the room. The table stood ready. The shelves were in place. The oven held its quiet promise. And the chair was no longer quite where it had been. It stood slightly angled, turned just enough to suggest use, not tucked away, not set aside, but present. Thomas looked at it for a moment, then nodded once, almost without thinking. He began his work. Flour into the bowl, water, yeast, salt. His hands moved as they always had, steady, certain. But the feeling beneath the work had changed. There was no longer the same sense of distance, no quiet separation between the rhythm of the day and the part of him that lived within it. Instead, the two moved together. As he kneaded the dough, the memories came again, but not as fragments. This time they stayed. A table, darker wood, a window open to the air, the sound of leaves moving just beyond it. And her, not as a distant figure, not as a voice without form, but as she had been, sitting, watching, speaking. "You rush the corners," she said. Thomas almost smiled. "I do not." "You do." The memory settled into the movement of his hands. Fold, press, turn. "I'm not rushing," he said, quietly. The bakery held the words. The oven gave a soft, steady breath. There was no answer, but there did not need to be. The dough softened beneath his hands. the rhythm carried on, and the memory remained. The morning unfolded. Mr. Pike arrived first, as he always did. "Morning, Thomas." "Morning." Mr. Pike paused slightly, his gaze moving around the room. "Something's changed," he said. Thomas glanced up. "Yes." Mr. Pike nodded. "Couldn't say what." He selected his roll, his half-loaf, and placed the coins on the counter. "Feels easier," he added. Thomas wrapped the bread. "Yes." Mr. Pike gave a small, satisfied nod. "Good." And then he left. Mrs. Fenwick followed. She stepped inside, removed her gloves, and paused just long enough to take in the room. Her gaze moved to the chair, then back to Thomas. "Well," she said. Thomas waited. "It's about time," she added. Thomas did not ask what she meant. Mrs. Fenwick placed her order. 2 buns, 1 turnover, as always. "You've stopped holding it so tightly," she said, as he wrapped the parcel. Thomas's hands paused for the smallest moment. "Yes," he said. Mrs. Fenwick took her parcel. "That's better," she said, and left. The morning moved forward. Customers came and went. The bell rang. The oven warmed the room. And through it all, the feeling remained. Not unfamiliar, but newly understood. The bakery was the same. But Thomas was not standing apart from it any more. He was within it. Later, as the rush passed and the quieter part of the morning settled in, Thomas stepped away from the counter. He crossed the room. This time he did not hesitate. He went directly to the chair. The light had reached it again, laying softly across the seat. He stood beside it for a moment. Then he sat. The movement was slow, careful, not uncertain, but deliberate. The chair held him easily. It felt familiar, not in the way of something used often, but in the way of something known. Thomas rested his hands on his knees. The bakery stretched out before him, the table, the oven, the counter, the letters beside the flowers, everything as it had always been. And yet, from here, it felt different, not distant, but shared. He sat for a long moment. The room remained quiet. The oven breathed softly. The light shifted. And within that stillness, something settled fully into place. Not a memory, not a thought, an understanding. He had not lost anything, not entirely. He had stepped away from it, and now he had stepped back. Thomas drew a slow breath. Then, after a while, he stood. He adjusted the chair slightly, not back to where it had once been, not fully into the room, but somewhere between, a place that allowed for both. Then he returned to the counter. The day continued, the bakery filled again, voices returned, bread was sold, but the feeling did not leave. It remained quiet, steady. By the time the afternoon came, the light had softened. The warmth of the oven had settled into the walls. The sounds of the lane had slowed. Thomas stood at the counter, wiping it clean. The letters rested beside the flowers. He looked at them, not with question, not with uncertainty, but with recognition. They had done what they were meant to do, not by explaining, but by bringing him back to what he had already known. He did not reach for them, he did not need to. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the chair. It stood where he had left it, no longer empty, no longer waiting, simply part of the room, part of the day, part of him. As the evening approached and the bakery prepared to close, Thomas moved through his routine once more. But now each movement carried something more than habit. It carried presence. And when at last he stood at the door, the key in his hand, the day behind him and the evening ahead, there was no pause. He stepped outside. The air met him. The willow stirred. The village moved gently toward night, and this time he did not feel as though he were leaving something behind. He felt as though he was carrying it with him.
Chapter 12. The Warmest Loaf. The morning came as it always did. Soft light in the window. A quiet stirring of the day. The slow return of warmth to the bakery on Willow Lane. Nothing in the world had changed, and yet everything had settled. Thomas woke before the light fully arrived. Not because something called him from sleep, but because rest had come easily and leaving it felt just as natural. He sat for a moment at the edge of the bed, listening to the stillness of the building. It was the same stillness as always, but it no longer felt like something to move through alone. He dressed, tied his apron, and made his way downstairs. The bakery waited. The table. The shelves. The oven. The chair.
He paused at the bottom of the stairs, not as he once had, not holding himself apart from the room, but simply to take it in. Then he stepped forward. The shutters opened, the lamps lit, the oven woke. "Easy now," he said. The fire took hold quickly, the warmth rising as though it recognized the work ahead. Thomas set the bowl on the table and gathered the flour. This time, as his hands moved, there was no searching. The rhythm returned easily. Fold, press, turn. Fold, press, turn. The dough responded as it always had, softening, shaping, becoming. But now the work carried something more than habit. It carried memory, not in fragments, not in distant impressions, but in something steadier. He could see the darker table clearly now, the open window, the movement of the air, and her sitting in the chair, not just as she had been, but as she had always been within the space. "You're taking your time," she said. Thomas's hands moved through the dough. "I always do." She smiled faintly. "Not always." The memory did not fade. It did not slip away as it once had. It remained. Part of the work, part of the room. When the first dough was set aside to rise, Thomas began the second. Butter, milk, currants. The scent deepened, filling the bakery with warmth. He moved to the pastry bench. Apples sliced, sugar added. The familiar rhythm of small tasks done with care. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, everything allowed. By the time the first trays went into the oven, the bakery had fully come to life. The warmth settled into the walls. The windows misted lightly. The scent of bread began to rise. Thomas moved through the rest of the morning preparations. Bowls washed, surfaces cleared, the chalkboard set out. He wrote the day's offerings carefully, as he always had. Today, farmhouse loaves, seeded rolls, currant buns, apple turnovers, honey cake by the slice. Then he placed the letters beside the flowers, not as something separate, but as part of the room. He opened the door. The morning entered, cool air meeting warmth, bird song from the willow, the village beginning again. The first customer arrived soon after, Mr. Pike, as expected. "Morning, Thomas." "Morning." Mr. Pike stepped inside, pausing briefly as he always did. "Smells good," he said. "It does." He selected his roll, his half-loaf, placed his coins. Then, as he turned to leave, he paused again. "That chair," he said. Thomas looked up. Mr. Pike nodded toward it. "Looks right," he added. Thomas followed his gaze. The chair stood angled slightly, catching the light. "Yes," he said. Mr. Pike gave a small nod, then left. Mrs. Fenwick came next. 2 buns, 1 turnover. She did not comment on the room this time. She did not need to. As she took her parcel, she glanced once toward the chair, then back at Thomas. "Good," she said simply, and left. The morning continued. Customers came and went. Voices filled the space. The bell rang and settled, and through it all the bakery held its quiet warmth. Late in the morning, when the rush had softened and the room had settled into its gentler rhythm, the door opened again. The woman stepped inside. There was no pause, no hesitation. She belonged to the room now. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." She moved toward the counter, her gaze passing over the letters, the flowers, the bread. Then, as before, it settled on the chair. She smiled. "I see you've been sitting there," she said. "Yes, and?" Thomas considered. "It's comfortable." The faintest hint of laughter touched her expression. It always was.
He wrapped a loaf without being asked, added a turnil, placed the parcel on the counter. She rested her hand beside it. "You've remembered," she said. "Yes. Not everything. No." She nodded. "That's all right." The words settled easily now. She took the parcel. Then, without asking, she crossed the room and sat in the chair. The movement was simple, familiar. Thomas watched her for a moment. Then, quietly, he moved from behind the counter. He walked to the table, then to the chair beside her. Not the same chair, but close enough. He pulled it slightly forward and sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The bakery stretched around them, the oven warm, the bread cooling, the light resting softly across the floor. Outside, the village moved through its day. Inside, the moment held. "It's different," she said. "Yes." "Better?" Thomas looked around the room, at the table, the shelves, the letters, the door, then back at her. "Yes." She nodded. They sat in quiet for a while, not waiting, not searching, just there. After a time, Thomas stood, returned to the counter, continued his work. The day carried on, but something had settled fully into place. There was no longer a sense of absence, no space left waiting, only the quiet presence of what had been and what remained. As the afternoon softened and the light began its slow turn toward evening, the bakery held its warmth. The chair remained occupied for a while, then empty again. But it no longer felt the same, because it was no longer kept for something lost. It was part of something returned. And as Thomas stood behind the counter, wrapping the final loaf of the day, he understood something simple. The mornings might look the same, but they were not, and they did not need to be. Outside, the willow tree stirred. The light faded gently. The village moved toward night. Inside, the bakery remained, warm, steady, and no longer waiting.